Welcome to C2GTalk, a series of one-on-one interviews with practitioners and thought leaders to explore the governance challenges raised by emerging approaches to alter the climate. I'm Mark Turner, Senior Communications Consultant with C2G, and I'm speaking today with Kumi Naidoo, one of the world's leading human rights and environmental activists. From an early beginning, fighting apartheid in South Africa, he rose quickly to global leadership positions, including International Executive Director of Greenpeace and Secretary General of Amnesty International, alongside many other roles. To this day, he's a prominent voice for global climate justice, serves as special advisor to the Green Economy Coalition, and hosts the Power, People and Planet podcast. Kumi Naidoo, welcome to C2GTalk.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
So the concept of climate justice has gained increasing attention over recent years and has emerged as a central issue in international climate diplomacy, including the COP process. How would you define climate justice, and to what extent do you think that the international climate diplomacy is adequately dealing with it now?
So to understand climate justice, you have to understand climate injustice. And climate injustice is very clear and simple, that those parts of the world that carry the biggest responsibility for the accumulation of greenhouse trapping gases are not the ones that are paying the first and most brutal price in terms of current climate impacts. And that the choices of what economic system, what energy system, what food system, and so on, all of these choices have not been made by people in countries that are paying with their lives, the livelihoods and infrastructure right now, right? It is not to say that, of course, extreme weather events are not also taking lives in the global north. When it happens in the global north, we should also note that it disproportionately affects people of color, working class people, and those that are more socially excluded. Not always, but quite often. And so when we then understand that injustice, then we have to say, well, to make that right, how do we do that? So climate justice is firstly about embracing in its full reality how we got to where we got to, right?
Okay.
And recognizing that some choices, policy choices that were made historically, when the science was not as clear, perhaps, were things that will fall in the basket of forgivable errors, right? But let's not pretend that it didn't happen, which is what a lot of dominant countries in the global north have tried to do. And thankfully, at Egypt, we saw a very significant symbolic turn in the sense that the notion of the loss and damage fund was actually accepted. Whether any money of substance goes into the fund, I'm not going to bet on it right now, right? The fact that principally it was won, right, I think is a positive step. But also it means, in practical terms, climate justice means also ensuring that there are technology transfers that are happening on renewable technologies, for example, that are really recognizing that lives have been lost already, right? And more lives we know for sure are going to be lost in the coming decades and beyond. And to respond to that with the urgency that that calls for, with the sense of equity that calls for, and the sense of justice. Let me end by saying, though, you know, when I was the head of Greenpeace, when Copenhagen failed, I was in a BBC Art Talk interview, and I made this point then, which I feel so strongly that we need to make more and more today, which is, in a very tragic way, climate catastrophe as we are facing offers us an opportunity. It offers us an opportunity to break away from the dichotomies of rich and poor, north and south, developing and developed. Because unless we really understand that this is the issue that has to bring humanity together to act collectively, true, the injustice of people in parts of the world that contributed least, yes, they will perish first. Small island states will get covered by the ocean and so on. But ultimately, nobody is protected. And that should drive us to a new sense of solidarity, maturity, understanding, and so on. But I would say, in conclusion, that the reality is that far too many of our political and business leaders still suffer from a very, very high level of cognitive dissonance on the question of how close to the cliff we already are.
So, to what extent do you think that addressing climate justice can be a bridge to a broader concept of global justice?
Climate injustice does not exist in isolation of global injustice. And part of that includes the domination of a small number of countries historically from the global north that made the most powerful decisions around economy, development, military spending, and all of those things. And those are the same countries that carry the burden of colonial brutality as well, to a large extent, right? And so the climate challenge is a failure of the economic system, the failure of our energy system, our food system, and so on. And all of those systems, let's be very clear, were not designed by the vast majority of people living in poor countries in the global south. The second thing is, in the way we try to address climate moving forward, we can't simply, for example, say, okay, we need to move to a green economy. So let's we build a new economy based on clean, renewable, fossil-free, energy, but we keep all the economic structures that dominated the fossil fuel industry the same. So therefore, you will see many of us, if we're saying we're gonna, if we make that connection between climate justice and global justice, we don't say we just need a green economy. We're saying we need a green, inclusive, equitable economy, right? And so all the challenges around equity and yeah, let me just say, right, I think even the environmental movement, if I can be self-critical here, doesn't want to talk sufficiently about a very uncomfortable word as we should be doing, and that word is consumption, right? And basically the reality is, if all of us in the global south were to have equity in consumption with everybody in global north, then basically the climate struggle will be completely over and we'll all be dead in a very short space of time, right? Because it's like when people talk about population, yeah, and here's a sort of good global justice, climate justice link. As the head of Greenpeace, I used to go to very, very many volunteer groups in the global north, especially, and they would sometimes ask me this question, correctly so, why do we not take on the question of population more strongly? The question was right, but often, and even in generalized audiences, the question of population always comes up, right? And climate, and then, sometimes people will say it black and white. They'll say, you folks in Africa have too many kids, right? Unless you'll stop having so many kids, we'll never solve the climate problem, right? And so my response to that is, I genuinely believe that we must address the population question. We should not dodge it. Secondly, the way you address the population question is through turbocharging, accelerating, and advancing gender equality. That is what transforms family sizes that we've seen around the world. And thirdly, you start making serious investments in how do you address all, issues. So, and then I say, well, having said all of that, it takes the consumption, and this is just a ballpark thing. I don't want to be held accountable for this as this rigor, very, very scientific statistic, but it's going to take at least about 100 to 150 kids in Africa to equal in a lifetime the consumption of one kid, say, in North America or Europe, right? And so we need to be very clear in not de-historicizing how we landed there, and then with all brutality and honesty, in brutal honesty, sorry, we have to be able to say, well, how do we recognize we can't reverse the past, acknowledge it, look at how we redress it, but try and build a future that does not replicate the injustices and lack of equity that we've seen in the past. And for that to happen, may I say, it cannot have the approach that we have seen after the global financial crisis, or even now, I would say after COVID, which is all about system recovery, system protection, and system maintenance. What was needed after the 2009 global financial crisis, and what is needed even more urgently right now, is system innovation, system redesign, and system transformation. And any one of us who is saying to ourselves right now that we will secure the safety of our children and their children by rearranging the deck chairs in the Titanic is in serious denial about how close to absolute catastrophe that we are.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about the 1.5 number. Hard fought by a lot of countries to get that on the international agenda. At the same time, we keep seeing increasing warnings from scientists that there's basically no credible pathway to 1.5, that there will inevitably be some overshoot. The question is for how long and by how much. In an article for Al Jazeera, you noted the idea 1.5 to stay alive had changed to 1.5 we might survive. It's a broad question, but where do you see the status, both sort of politically but psychologically, of this 1.5 goal right now? How important is it to hold on to it, given the scientific warnings that it may not be possible? What kind of psychological impact will it have if we cross that? I'd just be very interested in your thoughts on that.
So if I can just tell a little story, right? In 2015, I was in Kiribati, Fiji, Vanuatu, and the wonderful people there that I met taught me the slogan 1.5 to stay alive in July of 2015. 6 months later, when I met them at the Paris climate negotiations, they pulled me, some of them pulled me into a small protest they were having. Actually, it turned out to be quite big, which they got permission to have just outside the negotiating chamber. And they gave me the megaphone, and as I was about to start chanting the slogan they had taught me 6 months earlier, 1.5 to stay alive, and somebody started waving and saying, the slogan has changed. It's 1.5, we might survive. Now, I want to make a very painful point here. And I think unless we are honest with ourselves, we are going to make the same mistakes we've always made. So in 2009, when the Copenhagen negotiations collapsed, a colleague of mine from Greenpeace China gave me a blank piece of white paper and said to me, I was new at Greenpeace, like 1 week into the job or something, and they didn't know how I spoke and all. And he was telling me, he was a communications person. He said, Kumi, you got to smash this thing down on the table and say it's disgusting how they have, betrayed the people of the world and so on, right? And so, I thanked him for his guidance, and I didn't quite do exactly what he asked me to do, because it turned out that I was then deemed to have done too much, that I had crossed the line, as some people say. And I said then, we must ask the question, would the level of urgency be as low as it is now, right? If the people most impacted right now and who are losing lives right now were from places which had a lot of natural resources that economies in the north needed, would the level of urgency be different if these were economically strong countries? Would the level be different if they were militarily strong? And then lastly, and this is where some people said I crossed the line at that time, or would the level of urgency be so low if it were not for the color of people's skins, right? And here's the dilemma we have. If we look at all our institutions, including the institutions that are pushing for the big changes that we need to make, sadly, they are all burdened by the problem of structural racism, right? The powers of who gets voice, all of that is extremely still stuck in an old, it's not as if organizations are not trying to change. If you look at the international NGO sector, there are been perpetually for the last 30 years trying to change, but it's one thing saying, we recognize we need to change, but then don't exercise the kind of moral courage that is necessary to be as global as the challenges that we seek to achieve is a problem. And so when we look at the question of where we are at 1.2 now, it's tragic. Firstly, we have to say it is a tragic failure of political and economic leadership. And yes, where I'm going to step on some toes that I don't normally do, it's also a failure of activist leadership. Right? Of course, the situation will be much, much worse were it not for the sacrifices and the fights that people have made against tremendous odds. But right now, we're at a point where if we are saying it cannot be business as usual, it cannot be government as usual, we also have to be saying it cannot be activism as usual, because we are winning important battles. Let's be clear, against extreme odds, we are winning important battles. But we must acknowledge we are losing the overall struggle, right? And if we're losing the overall struggle, then we have to recalibrate. We really have to ask, how do we? And so it was within that context, one of the issues, the Al Jazeera article that you referred to, is that because the science is, you know, the math just doesn't add up. And I am not a big advocate for carbon dioxide removal. Let me just be clear that it's not something that comes like naturally out of my inner being. But when I look at the fact that the reality we face is if we tomorrow magically were able to switch off all emissions, right? All emissions we switch off. As the favorite gangster in my local community when I was growing up, Karayawar, said, we are still completely screwed, right? Because the emissions that are there, right, are still going to cause immeasurable damage. So if we say we cannot find a climate-centric, a climate justice-centric way of doing carbon dioxide removal, which is what I think we need to be searching for. And I would rather most of it be through natural carbon dioxide interventions such as mass tree planting and so on, which, by the way, is one of the reasons many people in the global south are questioning this whole new sort of emergence, is because they say, well, you know, why should we take these people in the global north seriously when they could have been investing anyway now in mass tree planting initiatives as the IPCC called for in 2018, right? But they're always going to look for more shinier, big gadget stuff interventions, which they'll come and first experiment with us in the global south. And so those tensions are not easy. Let's say it's not easy to deal with, but we have to put it all on the table and recognize that if we say we don't even want to look at it at all, then let's be clear about what that means. That means we are saying the people of the Pacific Island states are totally dispensable. We don't care about them, that their lives don't matter. We are saying that the lives of people in various coastal cities around the world, in Bangladesh for sure, in Ghana for sure, in many, many other countries, other small island states in other parts of the world, we're saying basically, we are making a decision to say they don't matter. So having said all of that, am I scared about carbon dioxide removal? Am I worried about the way that both the policy, the practice, and where the money is dominated by the global South, of course I'm terrified. But I believe we have no choice but to try and get on top of it, try to make sure it's not another wild, wild west situation as the fossil fuel industry was, and try to get it under some form of global governance and control, that the decisions are not just made by the people who are going to benefit commercially. Because right now, companies are just setting up things and going. And in that sense, sorry, I went on a bit of a rave because...
I mean, I'm glad you did, because carbon removal is clearly a lot in the spotlight at the moment and has seen a huge amount of attention over the past year or so, especially in the US now. So I think it's important to get into it. I was wondering to what degree you can frame carbon removal as a form of justice or restitution. I know that some people talk about it in terms of decolonizing the atmosphere, but some sense of historic polluters trying to undo historic harm. Is that a fair framing for it? Or do you, because traditionally there had been a sense of, oh, you know, we're going to impose this new technology north on south, but you could flip it around and see it as a justice.
Now, my interest in this conversation, and I've been a member of the Global Carbon Removal Partnership led by Dr. Sanjeev Kajram out of Thunderbird School of Global Management. And my interest in this is to make sure that the global South is not marginalized, and that we try to flip it around in that way. But as you well know, right, Mark, that's like a Herculean task, right? And we shouldn't, you know, like state it as if it's something that will happen, even if there was political will. Even with political will, it's hard to make happen. So I think the challenge we have is that far too much of the capacity, intellectually, research-wise, investment-wise, the numbers of people engaged in the conversation on carbon dioxide removal and so on, are substantially in the global north, right? So the one thing we need to do is make sure that this conversation and any initiatives, right, need to balance the participation of people. So that's the one thing that we absolutely need to do. And let's be blunt about it, where we are now is a very, very long way from where we need to be in terms of just basic justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, right? The second way we can flip it around is to make sure that people, in the way we do any of these initiatives, and I would say even leave carbon dioxide removed, but even the way we make the transition from fossil fuel energy to renewable energy, let's do it with the spirit of redress. Let's do it with the spirit that these communities were the ones that paid the brunt for the over consumption in the global north and with its consequent emissions that came with it. Let's recognize they've already paid a whole range of different costs in terms of extreme weather events, all of which are going to increase as we move forward year on year. So that's what I'm saying. If any technologies are developed, these technologies should be made available either pro bono or on a substantially reduced basis. And we know how hard the fight is for the global South with the patent regimes that we have, even in terms of life-saving pharmaceutical drugs or any other sector we want to look at. The last thing I would say is, in terms of flipping it around, it is also about making sure that there is absolutely nothing that is experimented with, that is tried with without scientific approval, right? Whether it comes from the IPCC, some appropriate UN body or whatever, and that it should be done in a way that we don't replicate economic injustice in the way most economic projects are constructed today.
I wanted to touch on another even more controversial technology, some scientists are exploring the possibility that you might be able to reflect some sunlight back, a small portion of incoming sunlight from the stratosphere or from brighter clouds, an idea called solar radiation modification. But I mean, obviously could create new risks of its own. It's there to address risk, but could create new risks of its own. And there's a lot of uncertainty around these ideas. And over recent months, we've seen quite a lot of debate about whether there should be research, how there should be research, basically how the world might go about governing this, whether that's even possible at all. I'd just be very interested in your thoughts. Have you put that on your radar screen as a sort of an avenue of inquiry, and how that fits into the broader schema of a more just approach to this?
So the very fact that this exploration and conversation is happening needs to be recognized, that it's happening from the same places that brought us down this path to climate destruction, right? Meaning that it came very much from the global north, and it's the same places in the global north now are telling us that we need to do solar radiation and various other geoengineering type of things, right? Now, I take a very simple view to this. We are in a deep crisis in terms of what's happening in our atmosphere. The very fact that we even have to have these conversations is a failure of leadership in the past. Let's not compound that failure by moving forward with quote unquote solutions that are not tried and tested, right? So all I'm saying is that just because a solution is put forward that actually reduces emissions, right? Even if it does so substantially, right? Or even is able to draw down carbon, you know, but if getting that positive thing is going to give us 5 or 6 negative outcomes with substantial changes in our entire atmospheric reality, then that should surely not go ahead. So I'm not saying let's not have any discussion about it, because we are in such a deep crisis. I think there needs to, but we should not have a situation where these things can move forward without without there being a global consensus that this is not going to have impact. So for example, even if you take non-technological solutions, let's say, and I'm here just speaking as a layperson, I'm not a scientist, right? So let's just say that we say planting algae forests in the oceans will draw down, carbon dioxide from the oceans, and it seems like lots of people support it, and it's being explored. So, but even that natural intervention needs to be tested, right? You cannot say that suddenly, if we cover 1/3 of the world's oceans in algae forests, that it might not have other unintended consequences. So we have the knowledge, we have the capability of actually trying to figure out what could. So it's basic due diligence. If you talk to people in business all over the world, they say before you do anything, given the social implications of getting it wrong, there has to be very high quality due diligence in the way we do this.
So if we take just the case of SRM, where do you think those kind of governance processes, conversations, deliberations should take place? Are there any fora that exist? And how would you do so in a way that's inclusive, meaning not just token inclusive, but bringing in people who truly understand the issues, the risks of doing, the risks of not doing, and are sort of, genuinely involved? How do you actually go about creating some fair, inclusive governance around SRM?
Well, the short answer is with extreme difficulty, right? Because we have a very broken global governance system, right? Our global governance system right now suffers from firstly, a democratic deficit, a transparency deficit, a coherence deficit, and overall accountability deficit. Let's just go through 4 of them, because if you don't look at it that way, you can't fully understand what the solution is. So on the democratic deficit, let's take the UN. So from all the institutions, you would say in some ways, from certainly the post-Second World War institutions with the World Bank, IMF, and say the UN and most of the UN structures with all its warts and all will tend to be on the democratic side a little, whereas the IMF and the World Bank is governed by a $1 one vote system, right? At least the UN has a notion of equity. But let's take the more democratic part of the global governance system, the UN. And if you look at the Security Council, so why should we have UK and France having a veto? There has been superpowers, right? In 1945, at the end of the Cold War, right? They were very dominant. They were colonial hegemons controlling large amounts of the world's population. Today, they don't control those. The only reason they could have that veto is because they possess weapons of mass destruction known as nuclear weapons. And then we look at, if you say every nation then that has nuclear weapons should be on the Security Council, then you need India, Pakistan, Israel, North Korea, and so on. So let's be clear that this Security Council doesn't reflect the new world reality and it's fundamental. So the second thing is coherence deficit. So, and this is, if you look at it more outside of climate, a country has the finance minister running off to the World Bank and the IMF, the foreign minister going to the UN, the health minister to WHO, the trade minister to WTO, and so on, right? Just stop for a moment and think what that means for a small country like Lesotho, Swaziland, a small Pacific Island state that has a population of 12,000. How do you survive in that system, right? But even in big countries, the incoherence around how these different ministers might perform at the global level is very high, right? So yeah, when we look at it from a climate perspective, whether it's on any new technology perspective and so on, we have to recognize that any of these initiatives that are being talked about, scary as they are, or promising as they are, whichever way you want to look at it, it will have multiple implications. So you have to look at it with the real intersectionality. So what are and let's be clear, there is no appropriate existing mechanism. And I'll tell you where I get closest to after I finish the other 2 deficits. Mm-hmm. The transparency deficit means that often these, most members of parliament, most local government councillors in most countries around the world don't understand how the global governance system works, with their place in it, and so on. So there's such a big disconnect, and unless, because it's very opaque and lacking in transparency. And all these 3 deficits give you then an accountability deficit. It also gives you then a compliance deficit. So the terrifying thing, I want to share something painful. I had a call after the Al Jazeera article came out with some close colleagues on the African continent who reached out to me with concern about what that article meant, about me saying, let's look at it with an open mind, right? And they said, I'll go more than saying that I don't simply respect and honor the work. I really love, respect, and honor the work. So it was very painful for me to hear that sentiment. But the most important thing, which I agree with them on, right? I was urging them that we need to look at how do we have a pathway to save the folks in the most vulnerable places and so on. And then, the thing that resonated with me, they said, how many times have we gone with optimism and hope and got a UN conference or some governance treaty at the global level to be agreed? Like, for example, the Green Climate Fund in 2015, which is supposed to be fully funded by 2020 and so on, right? And they said, how often have we gone And we would celebrate at the end of it that, yes, there were words and commitments raised by the dominant nations of the world. And then we say, oh, okay, we won, only to find that it's not implemented. So given all of that, right now, I think these decisions must be rooted in science and scientific clarity as much as it's humanly possible, right? And I think that the best governance possibility we have, warts and all, is to try to see whether we can carve out a kind of unique role within the IPCC process for there to be a IPCC special commission on carbon dioxide removal that should be recognized and given appropriate resources and support and presence, and to see how we can, and then to push to mobilize acceptance for the rulings that come out of the IPCC. And I know many people will say, quite correctly so, that the IPCC is an extremely conservative body. There's too much of mediation that happens there, that the 5-year assessments are always less serious than it turns out to be, and so on and so forth. But in a world of limited choices and declining choices, I'm not saying I'm wedded to that, but I would say that could be a possible option in the absence of other options.
I just wanted to finish picking up on, you brought up the idea of optimism and hope, just to be dashed, or to be, I mean, you spent a lifetime as an activist, ups and downs along the way, but you're still active, you're still going at it, you've still got the energy. How, it can be extremely challenging to stay motivated in climate, especially when you see so many challenges. What kind of philosophies do you turn to? Where do you draw your energy from, and how do you keep on going despite the size of the problem, recognizing the depth of the problem? I'm not talking about hopium, but still maintain a sense of agency and an ability to move forward.
So firstly, let me say on the observation of ups and downs, there have been substantially more downs than there have been ups, firstly. And secondly, I would say that in this moment, we have to be saying to ourselves that pessimism is a luxury we simply cannot afford, right? Thirdly, what we should be saying to ourselves is that the pessimism of our analysis, right, of the scale of the problem can only and best be overcome by the optimism of our creativity, our intellectual excellence, our participation, and our search for a better way forward. Sadly, because of the greed in the economic system and the way injustice has been allowed to prosper, far too many people have already died, and far too many people will also die, right? Unnecessarily, if we had made the right decisions some time ago in Rio. Rather than have the attitude of George W. Bush had in Rio, where he waved his finger and said, the American way of life is non-negotiable, what we should have had then was, let's get together and look at the scale of problem, and not having fossil fuel companies have the data and hide it and do campaigns that actually said the opposite, right? So optimism right now must come from the understanding that humanity can, should, and must be substantially better than what we are right now in the policies we make and how we actually make the changes that we need to make. And let me give the way you said it kind of reminds me of an invitation I recently got to speak at an event, and I said yes, and the person wrote back very nicely, thank you, Miyatsor, and then said, it is really nice to see somebody of your age continuing to participate and be active. But let me give you this 4.5 decades sort of reflection of, so this is one of the most, on the negative side, this is one of the most scariest moments I've seen. We've got a convergence of crisis, a boiling point. had, we are on a suicidal trajectory, quite frankly. But on the positive side, I don't remember any moment at all at a global level when I've looked at the world and I've said, wow, the appetite for deep structural and systemic change is higher today than it's ever been. Right? What I mean is people recognize that it's no longer a question of rearranging deck chairs, making incremental baby steps this way and that way. We live on a finite planet, and there are more and more people, not the majority, I just want to be clear, not the majority, but more and more people, significantly growing in number, understanding that we don't secure the future of our children and their children by not being willing to ask some big questions about how do we bring down the level of economic inequality in the world, for starters, right? And understand, there are a lot of good rich people in the world, right? But we all must understand, those of us who have incomes and so on, and especially those that overconsume on a very large basis, that because you do that, and you have secured that right for yourself, therefore, thousands of others cannot have much less. Martin Luther King put it very well when he said, we should refuse to adjust to economic conditions that will take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few when millions of God's children are smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in an affluent society. And he was saying that in 1965 when I was 4 months old. And if that was accurate in the US then and globally, it is 1,000 times more accurate today. And so unless we're willing to address some of those fundamentals, and the good thing is, as I told Greta Thunberg and Fridays for the Future, when they received the Amnesty International's Ambassador of Conscience Prize, I said, let's make the struggle for climate justice fun. Let's celebrate community. Let's enjoy ourselves. Let's make sure that we are laughing along the way. Tragic as the challenges might be, we have to not give those that didn't have the political courage to do the right things the benefit of knowing that they also extracted any possibility of happiness from current and future generations because of just, our kids, especially young girls, are asking themselves the tragic questions about should we be having children? This is not just isolated. Every country I go to, young people are coming up for those kinds of conversations. So within all of this, every community you go in the world, I see joy, I see happiness in the poorest communities, right? So my philosophy is, let's become more creative in our activism. And let me just say one thing about a critical thing, which I've made many mistakes, and I think many of us do, is that in the climate struggle especially, and in other struggles as well, when we talk climate, all our narratives up to now has been aimed at the head, right? It's been aimed with 1.5 degrees, 350 parts per million, LULUCF and all sorts of other acronyms that, even the majority of people in the climate negotiations are not exactly aware of, right? And so, and then on the other side, we've got, for example, people like Steve Bannon, who have long dispense of facts, right? They are very, very comfortable with gross untruths and lies, right? But one of the things we can learn from them is that they don't put all the energies into facts and scientific arguments and so on. They remember that there's a thing called the heart, right? And they understand that people get moved into actions by emotions, by passions, and so on. You can do this little experiment, gather people around a kitchen table and ask them what's the favorite movie, song, speech that they heard or book. And they might say, it's this, it's that, or whatever. And then you ask them what it's about. Most people won't actually remember the detail of how it, exactly what it's about. You know what they'll remember? They'll remember how it made them feel, right? And so we have to take into account people's feelings and to build the kinds of feelings that build the kind of society that we want: compassion, solidarity, love, understanding, tolerance, inclusion, all of that.
Kumi Naidoo, thank you so much for being such a great guest on C2GTalk. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me, Mark.